Okay. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Welcome to the Jackson Hole History Museum. My name's Morgan Jowen, and I'm the executive director of the museum. And tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from Kimberly Geil here. She's been a longtime friend and partner of the museum, and it's just always nice to host her because of all of the incredible work that she's doing with the Exum History Project. I'm sure some of you have seen her present here at the museum before, or know her personally, or are familiar with her project, but it's really incredible work that she's been doing. And she has been working on the Exum History Project for about a decade now. So she started collecting the history of Exum Mountain Guides in 2015, and she shares that history on a website called exumhistory.com. And I was looking at your website this morning, and I really enjoyed her homepage where she states what the project is. And I'm just going to read that for you. She says, adventurers, rebels, teachers, meet the people behind Exum Mountain Guides, the oldest mountain climbing school in the US. With over 90 years of history and counting, there are untold stories to be shared, and this site is where you can find them. So Kimberly really is kind of the expert on this mountaineering history here in the Tetons. And tonight, we're specifically going to hear about Paul Petzoldt, who was the first mountain guide in the Tetons, and we'll have a special opportunity to see a handful of original photographs from his early climbing here. Some of the photographs that you'll see, the ones specifically of Paul, have only been seen once before publicly, and that's because they're a part of a private collection. But we, the History Museum here, are working on acquiring those photos. It's this incredible collection of almost 200 photographs that were recently discovered. So our goal really is to bring these photographs home so that they're publicly accessible here at our nonprofit. And to do that, I'm sure you're suspecting this, we do need to raise some money to bring that collection home. So thank you if you've already supported this project. And if you have not yet, tonight's a great time. We're kicking off a match campaign that I'll share a little bit more after Kimberly's presentation. So now I'll introduce Kimberly with a little more detail. She is the third generation in her family to work at Exum Mountain Guides. Her uncle, Peter Lev, began guiding in 1960 and later was one of the 4 guides Glenn Exum sold the climbing school to in 1978. Her grandfather, Lester Lev, worked in the Exum office the same summer his son became an owner. And when Kim was only 12, she came out here and visited her uncle. And that was the start of her love affair with the Tetons and the climbing school. And then she began working full-time in the Exum office in 1996. So she continues to work at Exum, as well as a lot of other things here in Wyoming and California. So welcome, Kimberly.
I have a favor to ask of you. I have a favor to ask. My mom isn't here, and she would love it if you would say hi to her. Actually, I really just want to embarrass her. So are you game if I video you and you all say, her name's Louise. So say, hi, Louise, something like that. Everybody ready? I'm going to start. Okay, ready? Everybody go. That's awesome. I love it. Thank you. Okay, so we are here to talk about how a 16-year-old kid from Idaho became the first mountain guide in the Tetons. You all know it's Paul Petzoldt, and I would argue that it was a combination of courage, bravado, no lack of a huge lack of self-preservation, ingenuity, opportunity, and luck, which might sound like an odd combo, but that pretty much sums Paul Petzoldt up. People either loved him or hated him. Depending on who you talk to, he was either an absolute scoundrel or he was an inspirational leader, the likes of which people had never seen. And the reality is that he was probably both, because we humans are complex, right? And we can be lots of things, and Paul was definitely a very good example of that. So Paul was born in 1908. He was the youngest of 9 children. His father died of diphtheria when he was only 3 years old, so he never really knew his father. His mother was quite understanding of his adventures and his escapades. He was always scrambling around on the cliffs of the Snake River Canyon where they lived, and chores fell to him, whatever his older siblings didn't want to do, like cutting the heads off the chickens to eat, or he would take a gun with him to school and try to shoot things on the way to and from and trap things along the riverbank. So he was very able to take care of himself in all sorts of situations and conditions. When he was about 12 years old, he convinced his mother to let him and a friend take their old horse and a cart on what became a nearly 2-week expedition to the Sawtooth, because he was fascinated with mountains. His older sister used to read storybooks to him, and he'd seen the pictures of the mountains. He really wanted to check them out. But he and his friend were very disappointed when they finally got to the foothills. They were very rounded, and when they got to the top, they were all hemmed in by pine trees, and there was no view. So they didn't look at all like his imagination of what mountains should look like. When he was 16 years old, he met a young man a couple years older than him by the name of Ralph Herron. Ralph wrote poetry and plays, and Paul was an actor himself. He had had several roles in school plays. Here's one of them. This is And Home Came Ted, and it's hard to see, but he's the 6th role right here. Paul Petzoldt, Mr. Man, the Mystery. That was his role. Anyway, he and Ralph became friends. And when Ralph invited Paul to join him on a trip to Jackson in the summer of 1924, Ralph had some relatives there that he wanted to visit. Paul was delighted. So off they went. And that is really where it all began. Obviously, one doesn't become a guide if you can't climb. At least hopefully not, right? So if Paul and Ralph hadn't had the chutzpah to think that they could climb the Tetons, which as soon as they saw them, Paul thought, now that is what mountains look like. And they don't remember who decided first, but they each agreed they were going to climb the Grand Teton. And if they had not, then we wouldn't be here tonight. But they did manage to climb the Grand in the spirit of reckless teenagers everywhere. So despite getting all sorts of great information from Billy Owen about how to climb the Grand, who happened to be in town that summer, Ralph and Paul completely ignored it, preferring instead to go up the East Ridge, since it looked much easier and shorter. They paid for that decision dearly. They got benighted in a snowstorm and nearly succumbed to hypothermia because it was gorgeous when they left, so they left their jackets at camp because they'd be back in a few hours, right? They were not. They spent what Paul later said was the coldest night in all history and had a harrowing escape out of, they had to chop little handholds and footholds with a penknife they luckily had to get out of the situation and finally make their way back down to camp. So they survived, thankfully. Properly chastened, though, they did try again the next day. And this time, they did follow Billy Owen's advice and went up the way he had told them to, and they were successful. So they reached the summit on July 25th, 1924. And this is the card filled out after the fact by Frick-Sell. I'm going to show you some pictures from that climb later, but it's what happened after that first climb of the Tetons that set the stage for Paul to become the first mountain guide. Who do you think the first Euro-Americans to climb the Grand Teton were? I want a show of hands. How many people think it was Billy Owen and his party in 1898? Who all thinks it was Billy Owen with Spalding and Shive and Peterson? Okay, we have a few people. How many think it was Langford and Stevenson in 1872 as part of the Hayden Party? We got a couple of people for that. What about Captain William Kiefer, who was an Army surgeon stationed at Fort Yellowstone, said he came down to climb it on a hunting trip in 1893? We got a few hands for that. How many people have no idea? Okay, that's most everybody. Well, that debate still rages about who was the first Euro-American to climb the Grand. That's not what we're here to talk about, but Billy Owen does figure heavily into this story. And Billy Owen also had a knack for self-promotion that I think he and Paul Petzoldt shared. Maybe Paul Petzoldt learned from him a bit. So Billy Owen was very adamantly arguing for his first ascent of the Grand. And that's partly why there's such a rancorous debate. Real quick question.
Structure built a closure that might have been Native American or really.
There is indeed, and that is not the topic of this talk, but it is a fascinating place. Okay, so Billy Owen and his wife happened to be back in Jackson in the summer of 1924. I forgot I had a nice slide of the Tetons here that Morgan shared with me. That's from the History Jackson Hole collection. And according to a newspaper article that was from July 3rd, 1924, he had a specific goal, a specific reason for coming back to the Tetons. And it is that he wanted to climb the Grand Teton again. So you all look like you want to read it, so I'll read it for you. It says, W.O. Owen and his wife of Los Angeles are in Jackson at the Crabtree Hotel for a stay of a couple months in the valley. Mr. and Mrs. Owen were here for several weeks last year and signified their intention at that time of returning this year. Mr. Owen comes with a definite object this year of making the ascent of Teton Peak. This will not be a new undertaking for him, as he was the leader of the Owen-Peterson-Shive-Spalding party, who made the first successful ascent of the Grand Teton in the year 1898. See, he'd already convinced this newspaper said he was first. Reaching the top on the 11th of August in that year, but too late to do anything, ascending again on the 13th, erecting a flagstaff, leaving a metal container with an account of their trip, etc. Okay, so we know he was here in the Tetons with the express goal of climbing the Grand. So when he heard there were two young boys wanting to climb the Grand Teton, he gave them valuable information about how he had succeeded after many attempts with the help of others in climbing the peak. This is complete speculation on my part, but maybe he had an ulterior motive for helping these two young boys, because if they were successful in climbing, maybe they could then help him reach his goal of climbing the peak again. This is Billy, a much later picture. Indeed, after Ralph and Paul returned to town and Billy had verified their ascent by their description of the route, a week or so later, he did ask Paul if he would help him climb the Grand Teton. Now, Paul was only still in town because he'd been offered a job by a rancher named Bill Lucas to work on his ranch. Ralph was offered a job too, but Ralph turned it down. He decided he was ready to go back home. And if Paul had gone home with Ralph, we would also not be here tonight. But Paul clearly didn't have anything better to do and was delighted at the opportunity to have a job and a place to stay. So he stayed on to work on the Lucas Ranch. So he was still around for Billy Owen to ask him for help. And he was very honored by the request, especially when Billy said that he would cover all of Paul's wages and also pay him extra for helping him climb the Grand again. Billy Owen was still very fit. He was almost 65 years old, and he was having some heart trouble. Billy had promised his doctor that he would keep his heart rate below a certain level, and he got permission to give it a go. So to conserve his energy, he hired horses to carry their gear. This is probably not their horses, but it's still a cool picture. Paul went on a scouting trip above Bradley Lake and found a good spot that he thought would make a good campsite and was accessible by horseback. As word spread that Billy Owen and Paul were going to climb the Grand again, suddenly all these people that had told Paul and Ralph, well, why would you go up there? I ain't got no business up there. Why would anybody want to go up there? Suddenly everybody wanted to climb. And the group got much bigger. Billy Owen invited Frank Peterson, who had been with him in 1898. And another friend, Bill Lucas, the rancher, had a sister named Geraldine Lucas, and she wanted to go. She had a ranch at the base of the Tetons. She invited a couple of young friends. There was also a Mrs. Amaretti who ran a dude ranch who wanted to go, and she hired packer Gibbs Scott to help her up. So you could say that Paul actually had some competition early on for being the first mountain guide in the Tetons. But in the end, events would mean that Paul ended up being the only one. The campsite Paul chose worked well, but when the group headed out for the summit the next day, things quickly fell apart. The younger folks charged ahead, and of course everybody else wanted to prove that they were fit enough, so they went way faster than they should have. Geraldine quickly got tired and turned back, and so did Mrs. Amaretti. Billy kept on going. Paul kept trying to get him to slow down, but he wouldn't listen. He was checking his heart rate, but eventually it got too high, and Billy Owen too had to turn around. He told Paul, hurry up, catch up with the rest before they kill themselves. So 16-year-old Paul ran up to meet the others. At this point, there were 5 of them who did end up summiting. And he helped them. When he got up to them, they were a bit stumped by the exposure, so he got out his rope, helped them through the technical places, and 5 of them stood on top. Jack Crawford, that was Geraldine's friend. Jesse Dewey, he was from a pioneer family in Idaho. Gibbs Scott, the horsepacker. When Mr. Amoretti, his charge had turned back, he also ran to catch up with the others. Fred Kerner, who was a local interested in mountaineering, and then Paul Petzoldt. But Paul and Billy were both deeply disappointed that Billy had not been on the summit with them. However, Paul had learned a lesson he would take with him in the future, the importance of pacing. The only other person as disappointed as Billy and Paul, maybe even more disappointed, was Geraldine. The very next day, she drove to her brother's ranch to ask Paul to take her to the top. She wanted to quiet the talk she was hearing around town. People were saying the Grand is no place for a woman, but she was no ordinary woman. She was 59 years old. She'd homesteaded. She'd carved out a life for herself. And Paul admired her. He admired the way that she lived life on her own terms, and he wanted to help her reach her goal if he could. But he knew this wouldn't be the same as accompanying somebody who had equal physical capabilities. He knew it would be more of a responsibility. So he told her he would on his terms. They'd go more slowly. They'd hire Ike Powell's horses again and pack into a spot he found below the Middle Teton and spend the night. Then he said they'd spend a second night. He'd found a really great looking spot. There were some overhanging rocks by the waterfall. Those of you who are climbers probably know where those are. That was the first time they used what we now call Petzoldt Caves. Then on the 3rd day, they would attempt the summit. He also insisted that everybody drink water and eat food regularly. He didn't know why, but he'd noticed that people had more energy when they did that. And he made sure that they would bring extra clothing just in case they were caught in the storm. He had learned that lesson on his first attempt with Paul and Ralph when they'd almost frozen to death. So with Paul setting the pace, stopping frequently along the way so to make sure that nobody got tired out, Geraldine, her young friend Jack Crawford, he had summited on the ascent where the whole big group had tried, and Ike Powell, the horsepacker, made their way to the lower saddle. They stopped there to drink and eat more, eat their sandwiches, and then continued to the upper saddle and began the task of getting Geraldine through the climbing sections. So Geraldine, in many ways, was probably similar to some of the clients that guides around here take up to the top today, in that they really have no business being there, but somehow the guides get them up. That was probably the case with Paul and Geraldine. She was a strong woman, but not like she had never climbed. And so those parts were hard for her. She needed a lot of pushing and tugging to get her to the top, but she was very determined and never gave up. So he actually sent Jack Crawford across first to help place Geraldine's feet in the right place, and then helped her up the chimneys, again, belaying with the help of Jack and Ike. And eventually they all made it up to the snowfields at the top. Paul belayed her the whole way. He then stepped aside so that Geraldine could be the first one on the summit. And she took in everything around her and then turned and enveloped Paul in this big hug. He even thought he heard a sob, but she quickly regained her composure. And he felt it felt very meaningful to have helped his friend Geraldine reach this dream. They weren't the only ones on top, though. While they were resting at the lower saddle, they saw some other people coming up. And Paul was thinking, why is everybody wanting to climb the Grand all of a sudden when nobody was interested before? But it was 4 young men from Kelly who wanted to, they had a lodgepole pine pole and they had a flag that they wanted to put on the summit. So he was a little bit worried about them going ahead and kicking rocks down on them. So when they met up, Geraldine actually knew all of them, it turned out. He suggested, hey, why don't you guys go to the enclosure? He hoped that when they saw the enclosure, because from the enclosure, it's very steep and very daunting, that they get scared off. So 2 of them did, but 2 of them still wanted to go. But then they all joined forces, so he was still able to manage it, which he preferred. Anyway, they all reached the top. They planted their flag, and that resulted in these iconic photos. That's Geraldine in front of the flag on the summit of the Grand Teton. That's a good one. And then this one is Geraldine, Paul. He's doing his, he called it, I think, his conqueror's pose. And that is Ike Powell, the horsepacker, Alan Budge, one of the guys from Kelly, and then Jack Crawford sitting down at the bottom, Geraldine's friend. So while the others were savoring the view from the summit, Paul chiseled Geraldine's name into the summit block. You can still see it today. But then he started thinking about the hazards they would face on the way down, right? He had them descend in staggered groups so that nobody would kick rocks onto anybody below. He used the rope to belay Geraldine, and some of the others used it as a handhold. By the time they reached their camps at the caves, Geraldine's strength was nearly spent, but she was exhilarated by her accomplishment. And so was Paul. As he fell asleep, he thought about how satisfying it had been to help Geraldine in this way and decided he wanted guiding to be in his future. And it would be. Billy Owen approached him again once he heard about Geraldine successfully getting to the top, and he wanted to give it another go. Paul agreed, but only if they kept the party small. And so just him, Billy, and Ike Powell, the horsepacker. And if Billy agreed to let Paul set the pace. So Billy agreed, and they set off a week after Paul's successful climb with Geraldine. Paul made a plan for them to go around to the west side of the mountains, and he wanted them to spend 3 nights getting into position, so shorter days so that Billy wouldn't get too tired out. They went through Death Canyon, and they ended up in a broad basin that to Paul looked like what he thought Alaska might look like, so that's what it got named, Alaska Basin, at least according to Paul. Paul Horton would know for sure. On summit day, Paul continued to set a nice even pace, and they reached the upper saddle with Billy's heart rate in a good spot. Paul's better judgment was that they should go to the summit first and then to the enclosure on the way down. But Billy really wanted to go to the enclosure because part of the reason he wanted to climb the Grand again is he was always looking for evidence to prove that he was indeed the first to have climbed the Grand. So he was very enthusiastic about going to the enclosure first and seemed invigorated. So Paul gave in. And when they got to the enclosure, Billy was delighted to see that his name was still visible on one of the rocks where he'd chiseled it in 1898. And also delighted to confirm that from the enclosure, you could not see the actual summit of the Grand Teton. And you also could not see the route that he and his party had used to actually get to the top. So for him, that was further proof that he had been first. They scrambled down from the enclosure and headed to what Billy called the cooning place. I think today most people would call it the belly roll. Billy Owen called it that because it reminded him of raccoons squeezing through tight places. And then along through the crawl, Paul had never had any doubt about Billy's climbing ability. It was more the pacing and his heart rate that he was worried about. And other than one spot at the first chimney where Billy was too short to reach, so Paul climbed up to the belay and then gave Billy a tug. Otherwise, Billy was totally fine on his own. They quickly reached the summit and spent a good hour enjoying the view and reminiscing. So this is the typed summit register of Billy Owen and Paul Petzoldt from August 23rd, 1924. Paul re-chiseled Billy's name into the summit rock. Paul was clearly a fan of chiseling names into rocks. And Billy was overcome. He thought he would never make it up there again, but thanks to Paul, he had. And Paul felt a definite sense of pride at helping his mentor reach the summit one more time. So they descended. Paul belayed Billy in a few spots, picked up Ike. Ike had decided to stay behind because he was feeling some mountain sickness coming on, and went back to camp where they cooked up a hearty dinner of fried ham, biscuits and butter, and potatoes that they roasted in the coals. Ike brewed up some coffee and poured in some whiskey because he knew something that Paul didn't. The day before, Billy Owen had turned 65 years old. So they sang happy birthday to Paul and toasted his accomplishment. So Paul had now stood on top of the Grand Teton 4 times in less than a month, learning valuable lessons on the way, right? Always bring your layers, make sure to eat and drink, and pace yourself. Now it's time for Paul to go back to school, so he hitchhiked back to Twin Falls. But in the summer, he knew he had a job again with Bill Lucas. This is actually from 1958, so it's a little bit older than what we're talking about here. But he came back the next summer in late July with Ralph Herron again, another friend named Melvin Whitehead, and back to Jackson's Hole, which is what it was called at the time, and Bill Lucas's ranch. So the events of 1925 would cement Paul's status as the first mountain guide in the Tetons, but also give him a serious introduction to the risks that he was undertaking. So he hoped to find some people at the Jenny Lake campground that might want to be guided, but no such luck. However, with Ralph and Melvin, and then they picked up another guy named Harold Krieger, they decided to climb the Grand again, but this time they wanted to finish what they'd started. They wanted to go up via the East Ridge. And they were sure that they could. There was a pinnacle where they'd gotten stuck last time, which today we call the Molar Tooth. And Paul was sure that if they could just find a way around it, the way up on the ridge would be quite easy. So they quickly got up there. They were all young and strong. Ralph was feeling good and he wanted to go first at the pinnacle. And Paul said, okay, but that was the decision they would soon come to regret. Ralph didn't have nearly as much climbing experience as Paul. Ralph continued up. He got about, Paul belayed him. And this is one of the photos we are hoping to acquire. And you can see Paul and Ralph just above him. So Paul belayed Ralph and he got up about 25 feet above him, and then he got stuck. He couldn't go up, he couldn't go down, and he was starting to get tired. Paul could see his legs shaking. He knew that Ralph was peeling off in just a matter of time. So he wrapped the rope around a rock, hoping that they wouldn't both get pulled off. And then sure enough, Ralph lost his grip, started sliding down, it bounced on the ledge and then catapulted off. Paul was able to keep his fall to no more than 10 feet, but he couldn't keep him from going off the ledge. So horrified, the other three scrambled down to find Ralph, and he was in excruciating pain. They maneuvered him back up to the ledge. He was kind of semi-conscious, but he came to, and they were able to test all of his body parts. Everything was working except for one knee. Even with their help, he couldn't put any weight on it. So now they had to effect a rescue. This is now Paul's fifth climb, and they're effecting this rescue. So they tied Ralph's knee into like a semi-bent position so that it wouldn't move around too much. Paul put Ralph on his back and then carried him down with the others belaying him wherever it got too tricky. It took forever. They finally got back down to camp, exhausted, spent the night. There was nothing much they could do for Ralph, and then continued the process the next morning, making their way back down to Geraldine's ranch. They got a doctor from the Double Diamond Ranch to come check him out. And Ralph was lucky. He just had a very badly sprained knee and some cracked ribs. So he hobbled around on crutches for a while, but he was young, so he healed quickly. But that was the end of his climbing season for the summer. And it kind of dampened everybody's enthusiasm, right? So Melvin went back to Twin Falls and Harold went up north. And so Paul went back to work at the ranch. But only a week later, Paul would be called on to help with yet another accident in the mountains. So Paul was sound asleep at the ranch bunkhouse one morning when Bill Lucas burst in, shouting that the sheriff needed help. Someone had fallen to their death on the Grand Teton, and they needed his help to retrieve the body. Paul wondered who it was and what had happened, but the deputy sheriff sent to fetch him didn't have any details. He just told him that they were going to be going up with Paul, the deputy sheriff, and a couple local cowboys. And when Paul heard that, he said if he was going to be involved, then he was going to be in charge. He was 17 years old, mind you, but he was the only one with any mountaineering experience. And so the deputy sheriff said, sure, you can call the shots. So he wolfed down some pancakes that Mrs. Lucas made for him. They drove to Geraldine's ranch where they met up with the rest of the team. It was Jimmy Mangus, a local hunter and guide, and Bill Scott, who was the older brother of Gib Scott, the packer. Paul reiterated that he was going to be in charge of this operation, and no one had any objectives. Bill noted that Paul already had a reputation as being a sensible kid, and besides, he'd already been up there a few times, so sure, why not? So they set off. The others, Paul set the pace, but he could tell the others were impatient. So he reasserted himself again, saying if they rushed up now, not knowing what they were going to get into or how much energy it would take for them to retrieve the body, they could jeopardize the whole expedition. With that explanation, the others agreed, and Paul's leadership was absolute at that point. When they reached the site of the accident, it was on the snowfields below the head wall. They found the deceased man's partner and Gib Scott sitting with the body. Gib usually led pack trips to scenic lakes and glaciers in the mountains. But Theodore Teepee and W.D. Young, here's Theodore's Teepee signature and W.D. Young's signature, had asked him to take them up to the summit, and he had agreed. They summited successfully, but on the way down, Teepee and Young ignored Gibbs' advice to use the footholds the steps he'd chopped, and they went around the Bergschrund instead. They had climbed in Canada, and so they knew how to use their ice axes. But then Theodore slipped. He went tumbling down the slope. There was one rock, and he hit it head first. It killed him instantly. So Gibb ran back down to the valley to get help, while WD stayed with the body, and then he ran back up to keep WD company through what had to have been a long and very sad night. Gibb had brought canvas up that when Paul and the others got there, they used it to wrap the body in and tied it at both ends. Paul thought it would be easiest for them to go down the way that he and Ralph had tried to go up. Well, they had actually gone up the first time down a snow chute so they could slide the body instead of try to maneuver it over boulders. So what he did is he would belay the body down the slope, the length of one rope. Then with a second rope, he would belay Gibb down to the body. The others would use it as a handhold to get down, and then he would carefully climb down, and they repeated it over and over again until they got down to Amphitheater Lake, where they could load the body onto one of Gibbs' horses and take it back down. The tragedy was covered widely in the local news, and Paul was hailed as a hero for successfully leading the body recovery. Gibb blamed himself for Theodore Teepee's death, even though Paul tried to reassure him that it wasn't his fault. Paul had actually thought that perhaps he and Gibb could go into business together and guide together. But after that accident, Gibb absolutely refused to take anybody up into the mountains again, no matter how hard people begged. So that got Paul as the only guide in the Tetons. He may have been young, again, he was just 17, but having to recover a body so closely on the heels of his friend Ralph's accident made him think long and hard about the risks and responsibilities that he was taking on as a guide. But the accident was also a pivotal moment for him because he was determined that nobody else would get hurt while they retrieved the body, and that allowed him to really step into his leadership, despite his age, right? So this is really, I would say, when he stepped into the role of guide and all the responsibilities that came with it, because he decided that he was going to learn from his own and others' mistakes. And no matter who he was guiding, how much experience they had, how old they were, he was going to remain in charge. And less than 10 days later, Paul's transformation into the first mountain guide in the Tetons would be complete. He was back on Bill Lucas's ranch. This is another one of the photos we're hoping to acquire. Stacking hay when two dudes that he'd seen around town approached. Recognizing them, he climbed down from the haystack to see what they wanted. They'd heard that he'd climbed to the top of the Grand and wanted to know if he would take them up and how much it would cost. So without thinking, Paul said $100. Now, mind you, he was making $1 a day plus board as a ranch hand. But that was the amount, apparently, that Billy Owen had paid him the previous summer. So the dudes were a bit surprised. So they went to discuss it. And then they came back with one question: when could we start? Paul said, how about tomorrow? So he had already arranged with Bill Lucas that if he got the opportunity to guide, he could take time off. So the next day they went up. They were able to summit with Clement Cobb and Mitchell Gratwich of New York City on August 16th, 2025. So that was Paul's first true guiding in terms of taking people that he didn't know who were paying him to take them into the mountains. This was, again, a turning point for Paul, and I'm going to let you tell him about it himself in his own words. This is from a talk he gave when he was in his 80s to the Wilderness Education Association that he started up in Maine. So let's see if this will work.
The next day I was out stacking hay. And word got around these kids had gotten up the mountain. And I suppose the dudes thought, gosh, if these kids can get up there, maybe we could get up there. And we had the dude ranches in those days, you know, where people come out and play cowboy all summer. You know, from the main line, Philadelphia, from Boston, other places, big dude ranches. And so people started to talk about going up there. And these guys appeared down there and said they wanted to talk to me, and I jumped off the haystack, and they said that you really get to the top of the Grand Teton, and I used my boyhood expression, sure hell did. And they said, would you show us the way up? They didn't say guide, they said, show us the way up. And I said, sure. And they said, how much would you charge? And I don't know today why I said this, because I was being paid as the same as the other cowboys there, working in the hay fields or otherwise, which in those days was $1 a day and board. But I guess maybe I thought of the hypothermia, which I didn't know what it was called then. And I said, how about $100? Well, that staggered them a little. They said, we'll talk it over. And so they went back and I went to pitch it in. They talked for a while. They come back and yelled up. And so I jumped off and they said, when can we start? I said, how about tomorrow? 4 days later, I was back stacking hay with the summer wages in my pocket. I had a future. I had a racket. I was a guide. And that year I took up 4 more parties, and the next year I come back, and in a couple of years I was training my own guides. And of course, the number of great climbers who came from the guide service in the Tetons is phenomenal.
So there you have it. That's how a 16-year-old kid from Idaho became the first mountain guide in the Tetons. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Ralph was a little bit older. I think he was 19. What's that? He must have had, I'm not actually sure how he got back and forth. I don't think he had a car because Ralph and Paul hitchhiked from Twin Falls to the Tetons.
Always wondered about it. I'm sure people like Paul in the audience know the answer to this. How do you get horses up there? Do you have to skirt way over toward Shadow Peak, sir? Or how do you get a horse to the meadows?
What do you think, Paul?
And then get quite to the meadows, it's down the canyon.
Can everybody hear? Here, Paul, come over here if you're going to answer. The question was, how do they get horses up there?
They worked their way up the side of the canyon and stopped at a meadow in Garnet Canyon. It's about, you get to the top of switchbacks and you go around into the canyon, where you first see the middle Teton. Straight below the bottom of the canyon, there's a meadow, and that's where they have the horses.
Thank you, Paul. That's Paul Horton, by the way. If you don't know Paul, he's an amazing historian, and he has probably climbed every climb there is to climb in this range. Yes.
Did Paul wear cowboy boots on his first time?
That's a good question. The question is, did Paul wear cowboy boots on his first time up? I would say that they did not wear cowboy boots, or at least not what we think of today when we think of cowboy boots. I will show you a couple pictures, and we can't see Paul's boots very well, but we can see Ralph's, and they don't look anything like what I think of when I think of cowboy boots. So even though that is what you hear all the time, I don't think they were cowboy boots in that sense. Now, were they suitable for climbing? Probably not, but not cowboy boots per se. Yes, sir. And then in the back.
Say that Billy Owen said that he had left something at the top of the Teton when he claimed that he had gone up in 1898. And if he did say that he had done that, was that thing ever identified and found in a note?
So the question was, did Billy Owen say he'd left something up at the top of the Grand? And if so, was that ever found? So Billy Owen's party had gone back up, and they had left a summit register, and they'd also left a metal pennant for the Rocky Mountain Club. And that is one of the things that Paul and Ralph found. And one of the things that we have pictures of with them holding it on the summit of the Grand in this collection, which I will show you in a minute. So yes, that was still up there when Ralph and Paul climbed it later. Yes.
So that confirms that Owen had been up there.
Yes, we know for sure that Owen was up there in 1898. What we don't know, what the debate is whether or not Langford and Stevenson also reached it and whether or not Captain Kiefer also reached it. Yes. The question is who took the picture. I think it would have been Frank Edmonton was the other Kelly boy that had joined them. So there was another person up there and he would have taken it. I don't know whose camera it is, but somebody took pictures, thankfully. Yes. I have read that Ralph Herron had a box camera, and that's all I know about it, not being much of a photographer myself. I don't know if anybody else knows anything else. Any other questions? All right, then I'm going to invite Morgan back up.
Let's give Kimberly a round of applause. Oh, sorry, playing a little dance. I think we can all agree, right, that Paul Petzoldt really is an icon of Jackson Hole. The stories that Kimberly just told are just so incredible, right, and are so defining to the place that we know and love today. And I hope you feel the same way. As I mentioned in my intro, we are trying to raise some money to purchase these photographs for here at the museum.
Do you want me to show everybody the photographs first and then we'll talk about the campaign, or should we talk about the campaign and then show the photographs?
Let's put a few photographs on the screen. Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, you have them to narrate.
Yeah,
Great.
here. So yes, I was going to say that the set of photographs is amazing. There's almost 200. Morgan will probably tell you this as well. It also comes with the fruits of over 300 hours of research that the collector did. And he turned up some really interesting stuff. Like this, for example, which is the junior roster. And did you know, for example, that Paul, which is down here in yellow, he liked being rushed. He didn't like being teased. His favorite expression was, says which. I have no idea what that means. He acted indifferent. His chief weakness was stagging it, and he wanted to be a pugilist. Who knows what a pugilist is? Yes, he wanted to be a professional boxer. I had to look it up. So he found a lot of really interesting things. And we only have permission to show you a few of the pictures from Paul and Ralph's first climb of the Grand Teton in July of 1924, but here's a glimpse. So this one is of Ralph, and this is at the top of what is Teton Pass, looking down into Jackson's Hole. This is the original Howdy Stranger sign, of which there is a replica in a different spot up there today. This is a picture of Billy Owen in the summer of 1924, just before he turned 65 and climbed the Grand. That is Billy Owen in the middle, and he is showing Ralph on the left and Paul on the right where to go, which, as you already know, they ignored. This is Ralph and Paul starting off on their climb, Ralph on the left, Paul on the right. No backpacks then, right? So what did they do? They wrapped their things up in a quilt and tied it over their shoulder, as you can see for Paul right here. And again, you can't see Paul's boots very well, but you can see Ralph's. And they're not what we think of as cowboy boots. Yeah. They camped at Delta Lake, what they call Delta Lake. This is a picture of Paul at camp, and it's hard to see, but this says pork and beans, which he talks about having spent all the rest of their money on sardines and pork and beans. So that's what they ate to fortify themselves. Yeah. They were both thespians, remember? So here's Ralph being dramatic against the moonlit sky. This is Ralph on the crawl on their successful summit attempt, maybe on the way back, not sure. And this is Ralph on the summit holding the Rocky Mountain Club pennant. Again, not really cowboy boots. And this is Paul. The collector colored this one, but that's Paul on the top of the Grand Teton holding the Rocky Mountain Club pennant. And Paul had chiseled his name in the rock. And that was one of the clues that was integral to the collector being able to figure out what these pictures actually were and who they were and where they've been taken. So there you go. That's a little hint at some of the pictures that are in this collection. And now I will turn it back over to Morgan. Real quick, the question was, where were the pictures found? So another collector had them. I don't know where they'd been in all the intervening years. We're pretty sure it was Ralph's camera. The collector who found them bought a box of negatives from another collector. So obviously they'd probably gone from collector to collector and nobody knew what they were. But this collector, because of the name Petzoldt, and also he has a really good sense for photos. He says he never forgets a photo once he sees it. So even though he lives in Idaho, he'd never been to the Tetons, he's not a climber, he did all this research. He watched, I don't know how many hours of video of people climbing the Grand, and he pinned down exactly where all these photos were taken. He did show them to Paul Horton and I after a year and a half ago when he came here and showed some of them. And he did a pretty darn good job, didn't he, Paul? He did a very good job, only a few mistakes. Things that he misidentified, but he, so we have to give him credit for having realized what actually these were. Another question.
Do there happen to be any pictures of Pat Petzoldt in the collection?
Not that I'm aware of.
She was his first.
Oh, right. These are earlier. He hadn't met her yet. So he was too young when these pictures were taken to have met Patricia Petzoldt. Yeah.
Have the earlier claims of first ascent been denied or proven wrong by the time Owens went to the top?
No, I mean, that debate still rages and we'll probably never know. Okay.
Great. Kimberly will stick around too to answer more questions if you want to come up to her afterwards and ask as well. But I think just seeing a handful of these, some of you know that we have a large photo collection here already at the museum. And this area is a total gap. We maybe have 5 to 7 photos of Petzoldt in the collection, and that's it out of our almost 20,000 historical photos. And then I would point out too that, it was hard enough to get to the summit of these places. And so to take photographs as well is really unique. And to have that level of detail of these climbers on the Grand is really, really special. So when we saw these, when Kimberly and Ron presented these photographs, it became pretty obvious that these needed to come to the History Museum. So like I said, we are launching a match campaign tonight. Our goal is to raise $30,000 to acquire this photo collection. And with the funds, the museum will be able to purchase the photographs in both digital and high quality prints. They'll then be housed here at our museum in our climate controlled archive room in the basement and preserved indefinitely. We'll then be able to use them in future exhibits and programs and share them with researchers and the public in our research center. So that's our goal. We have this match campaign because a small group of really generous donors have come together to create the match fund, and they will match dollar to dollar that we raise up to $15,000 through the end of February. So we have 2 months to do this. And I want to pause and say a big thank you to our match funders. That's the Faraci family, the Townsend family, Triangle X and the Turner family, the Gottwald family, Lost Creek Ranch, Trailborn Jackson Hole Resort, and Grand Teton National Park Foundation. So a pretty great group who stepped up at the beginning to say, let's get these photos home. So, and I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you for helping us make this match and meeting this match in the next 2 months. A few logistics. If you're ready to make your donation tonight, Elizabeth is out here at the table in the hallway. Betsy at the front desk can also help you out. Or if you'd like to consider it, you can take a postcard, leave your email address with us, and we'll follow up with you. But we're really excited about this opportunity. And I think just seeing this room full kind of shows how important this topic is and this material is to our community. So thank you so much. Yeah, one final, yeah.
One more thing we did want to show you. You might have already heard, but there is a world premiere of a Wyoming PBS documentary that's going to be on January 17th in the afternoon, 2:30 p.m. It's part of the Alpen Film Fest. And this is a documentary that's about Paul and about the two organizations that he founded, what we know now as Exum Mountain Guides, but was originally the Petzoldt School of American Mountaineering, and then also the National Outdoor Leadership School, NOLS. So this documentary traces Paul's story, and then also they filmed some current NOLS groups and a current Exum group and wove it all together in this great way. It's a really great film. And so that's something that you can see if you're interested in this topic. But the reason I want to bring it up, it's called A Life Outside. Here's a picture. They do actually have footage of Paul with flour in his hat. I think it looks silly, but it's true. It was a slightly different hat. Anyway, Paul's climb, Paul and Ralph's climb is definitely a part of this documentary, and there are no photos. We don't have the rights yet, so they are not in this version of it. Right now, this is the film festival version, but by next year, the film is going to be streamed both statewide and hopefully nationally. They expect it to have a national audience. And when we raise the funds to bring these photos back to the History Jackson Hole Museum, the museum can then license them to the filmmaker in Wyoming PBS so that they can be a part of this documentary, which is absolutely where they need to be. So we're excited about having that opportunity as well.
Okay. Trailer? One final, and then we'll send you off. Okay. Thank you. So I'll just finish by saying that trailer was great, right? And it really focused on today, which is amazing. But our job here at the museum is to pair our history with what's going on today. And it's so clear that there was a gap there. There was that more mid-century kind of second half of the 20th century film footage, but totally missing the early 20th century mountaineering. So hopefully we'll be able to add that next year. Okay, thank you all. Have a good night.